Every year, billions of dollars are being spent on scientific studies that claim to have 80% chance of success. If that were really true, research should actually look very different, but it isn't. And according to Professor Andrew Gelman, the math isn't the problem, the assumption behind the math is the problem. So the question is not whether 80% power works, it's whether we are actually using it correctly. And today we are unpacking the 80% power myth. But before that, let's look at what this 80% power actually is. It is simply a statistical power. It is the probability that your study will detect an effect if that effect truly exists. So if your study has 80% power, it means that under certain assumptions, you have an 80% chance of detecting a statistically significant result. That sounds solid, but notice the statement, under certain assumptions. We'll come back to that, but for now, let's talk about where this 80% standard actually came from. In 1988, Jacob Cohen proposed the use of 80% power, and over time, it became a global standard. But here's the problem, because this 80% power that he proposed wasn't based on any mathematical proof. It was a practical judgment. Now, Cohen didn't really propose 80% power because it was perfect. He proposed it because researchers at the time were using low power, like 25% to 50%, which means they were missing real effects in their study and drawing confident conclusions from weak studies. So the 80% rule wasn't born from a theory, it was a response to a problem because researchers were running studies that were barely better than guessing.
To be fair, I think there are good reasons why researchers stick to 80% power. The first one, of course, is to reduce the chance of missing a real effect, and also it is because it's going to make the study to be feasible, because going higher, like having 90% or 95% power, means a larger sample size, more cost, and even more logistical challenges. But some researchers like Cullum and Atkinson point out that higher power should be used whenever it is practical. They wrote in their article that in the situations where additional risks and inconveniences to the subject are minimal and the cost of the study are low and the practicalities of the study are supportive, a higher power, like greater than 90%, would be more appropriate to reduce the risk of type 2 error. Now let's go back to the assumption, because this is where things really start to fall apart. Researchers like Higgs and Amrin, I just hope I'm saying this name correctly, Amrin argue that power relies heavily on assumptions, and in real life, those assumptions are often wrong. You assume effect size, you assume a model, you assume how your data behaves. But in reality, we don't know the true effect size. We don't know if the model is correct. So when you say this study has 80% power, you are really saying this study has 80% power in a world where my assumptions are perfectly true. And that world does not exist. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because once those assumptions stop holding, the way people interpret power starts to break. People often say 80% power means 80% chance of detecting a statistically significant result. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm among those people because that's what I thought. But that's not strictly true. It is true when all the assumptions hold, your effect size is assumed correctly. Higgs and Amrin further point out that statements like "we will detect an effect 80% of the time" are overconfident, because real world data doesn't behave that way or that neatly. So sometimes what people think power means and what it actually means are not the same thing. Now this is where it even gets more interesting, because statisticians like Andrew Gelman made an argument that if studies really had 80% power, then we should be really seeing extremely low p-values, because high power means strong ability to detect real effects. But we don't see that. So it's either researchers are extremely unlucky, which I don't think so, or the 80% power we claim that our studies have is not actually true. So this means that not all studies claiming to have 80% powers actually have that 80% powers in real. So we can say that the math is correct, because that's what you see on paper, 80%, but the inputs are wrong. And at this point, it is tempting to blame the number, but the thing is, 80% isn't the real issue. The problem is how we are using it. Because studies have shown that some researchers choose their sample size based on norms, not based on reasoning, which means we are not necessarily designing better studies. Now, where does that leave us? The thing is, using 80% power isn't wrong, but using it blindly is wrong. It shouldn't be a default you copy. It should be a decision that you justify, because different studies have different risks, different costs, and different consequences. So a good study isn't the one that just hits 80% power. It's the one that makes sense in context. So instead of asking, did I use 80% power, a better question would be, did I choose the level of power that actually fits this study? That's the difference between following a rule and actually understanding what you are doing. But this doesn't just stop at individual studies, because when the powered studies or poorly designed studies get published, they don't disappear. They become part of the evidence base, and that evidence base is what systematic reviews are built on, which raises even a bigger question. If the individual studies are flawed, then what happens to the conclusions built on top of them? If you really want to know what happens, it's all in this video. Bye.